socially radical, socially radical, socially radical. Socially radical, socially radical, socially radical. Guitarist. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Socially Radical Guitarist. The song you heard just now was from VOLA. It's called Napalm, and it's from the new album Witness. Very, very genty song, and I'll kind of break down how the offbeat ends up working and how it actually can sound familiar to a lot of Africans. But just before that, we're going to do the disclaimer. Now, any opinions expressed on the show by the host or any guest that the host brings on are the respective opinions of the host and the guest. They have nothing to do with Radio Waterloo, any of its subsidiaries, or any of its affiliates. So, no, try as you might, you cannot sue public radio over this program. And yes, while the African and Caribbean Inclusion Center is sponsoring the show, the expressed opinions of the host and the guests are the respective opinions of the host and the guests. They have nothing to do with the African and Caribbean Inclusion Center, any of its subsidiaries, or any of its affiliates. So don't sue the nonprofit either. Support the nonprofit, especially support the drive for full integration, full inclusion, and full equality, or just donate to the organization directly. Please support, please bring that solidarity for Africans so that they are fully integrated, fully included, and fully equal in Canadian society. Now, getting into how the music is broken down, it's very interesting. You'll find that a lot of people, when they hear this and they're kind of new musicians, they end up mistaking it for kind of like a 5/4 or a 7/4 beat, and they end up thinking it's a lot like what Tesseract does, and I'm hoping one day I'll be able to feature them, where they play the music and the guitar will deliberately go away from playing on the downbeat, and it'll seem like it's on an off time signature, but actually it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and you just need to give that time, and as the guitar continues to play that riff, eventually it'll go back to the downbeat. So my guitar's limited. I'm not going to be able to do all of the tricks in the key riffs that the guitar is playing, because he has a 7-string, I have a 6-string. But I can do basically the original, that first riff. And you'll hear that, and then he'll be doing some of the like a verse riff, a nice little verse riff, and he'll be using the offbeat to bring that effect and bring that illumination to the backing track while the main singer's singing. And interestingly enough, they'll do this even on the chorus. And if that sounds familiar to a lot of you African musicians out there, it's because that's actually where a lot of the djent sound ends up coming from. A lot of people consider a few bands as kind of like the father of that sound. It's Meshuggah. Um, Actually, interestingly enough, Nemec, Mnemic, and Viljarda. Um, where that sound ended up coming from is Meshuggah is a very, it's like their death metal band. Um, it's screaming throughout. There's no singing of any kind. Um, the lyrics very very well written, very nihilistic though. And of course the drummer is absolutely amazing. Um, and that comes from the acquired experience of all of the musicians put together. Um, and they're touring around the world and acquiring sounds from all over the place. So that's how you'll end up with such varied and beautiful music. They've been influenced by everything: jazz, reggae, Afro beats, and they'll play that stuff and they'll do incredibly creative things with the guitar. And um, it's a shame that Janti music like this is always suppressed to some degree or another. You'll be very hard pressed to find um, music that's promoted and celebrated that's using this sort of sound. I've noticed that as architects got bigger, they had to get away from it significantly, even though they were using it before, and they were emphasized very interesting sounds. A lot of interesting cultural sounds from Scotland and Ireland too. And as soon as they got big, that tended to die down and go away. It, um, but but yeah, like this ends up going towards the main thesis of the show, which is that proletarian culture is inherently multinational, and that's reflected in the music, reflected in Western proletarian culture. It's inherently multinational. This is a band from Denmark, um, VOLA, and that's that's reflected in a lot of the music that people from a working class background will end up promoting and playing. Um, and in many ways, it's a show that that culture, as the thesis of the show, the is an arena for class struggle. It's another arena for class struggle, and the right opportunists will, like a lot of right opportunists, like Cracker Caleb Maupin, Cracker Keaton Mansfield, and the Arab House Negro Hawes from the Infrared Show. Like they'll claim that um, the preservation of Western culture will inevitably mean protecting the legacy of the U.S. state. But that's a fallacy. That's a myth. Um, because the propagation of culture um, was deliberately designed to be controlled by the bourgeoisie, by the U.S. state. It was Bill Clinton, Democrats, the Nixon. It's initiated the process, but then you had, you know, the Jimmy Carters of the world, Bill Clintons of the world, George H.W. Bushes of the world, moving to monopolize the propagation of culture and to have it controlled by the the ruling class, the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie wants to create rifts and divisions among the working class. And the reason for that is to maintain the integrity of the central ideology that maintains the U.S. state, and that is white supremacy. And Canada, being a settler colony itself, also ended up benefiting from that. The real main difference between Canada and the United States and what happened and why the conditions are different for workers really had to do with the concessions that the working class managed to get after an outright civil war in the 1970s in Quebec and the militant labor struggles working in concert and in coordination with the indigenous. So what ended up happening was the country was initially a settler colony without much of a constitution, essentially an absolute monarchical, an absolute monarchy, settler colony. And in many ways, the conditions were actually worse than the United States because of that. It was much more difficult to bring cases forward to a court. It was much more difficult to establish some sort of basic constitutional framework for workers to be able to enforce their rights. For many years, the Communist Party was actually outlawed, for example. And while that was the case in the U.S. too, it was also possible. There was a legal framework for communists to challenge the illegality of the party in the U.S. That wasn't the case in Canada. Not until 1982, after all that class struggle, the Civil War in Quebec, and the indigenous struggles working together, all in concert and in sync, brought about the 1982 Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So what ended up happening is Canada ended up transitioning from an absolute monarchy settler colony to a constitutional monarchy. But that's not enough necessarily to guarantee security from fascism. The constitutional monarchy is really only a step away. One bad prime minister, and all of those gains could be gone. So those are important things to think about. And it's also important to think about when we look at culture and how culture is propagated in both Canada and in the United States. Those are the contexts, that's the conditions in which these things happen. And, in the second half, I'm going to be talking about the news, things that happen. For example, how, the reactionary judgment with Kyle Rittenhouse versus the sound and just judgment for Ahmaud Arbery. And why I believe the conditions allowed for a halfway victory for justice, not a full-on victory, like maybe about half. For not necessarily justice, but accountability, halfway judgment for accountability. Um, so yeah, that's what I'll be talking about in the second half. And stay tuned because I'm about to keep a promise as well. Promise that I made to the Vaniers. They will be featured. Um, they'll be closing the show, so stay tuned for that as well. Um, Song that's going to be coming up next will be from Eidola, and it's a song that I really like. It's the great. It's quite a mouthful. It's the Great Deception of Marquis Marchosias. The Great Deception of Marquis Marchosias, and it's from the 2015 album Degeneratera. Um, a lot like uh, VOLA, they experiment with otherworldly sounds. In many ways, uh, the band mainly keeps it folksy, but the way they write and the way they orchestrate the music is there's a lot of movement, and um, Eidola has said it themselves. They've actually written um, each each album to be part of a larger piece. So you listen to the Great Glass Elephant, then you listen to Generatera, um, and then you get the next album after, which is um, To Speak, to Listen. And then the final album is The Architect. So all four of these albums are meant to complement each other. This is a very unique way of writing. And it's really a shame that they're not getting their due, especially when they're under Rise Records. Blue Swan Records used to be independent, but now it's under Rise Records, which, to be granted, is also considered independent, largely because of a lot of the metal, heavy metal, metalcore bands that they highlight and promote. But actually, if you think about it, and yeah, even the Spirit Box, which I featured before, and right now they have Circus Survive as well. But because of the way they write their music, they put a lot of depth and energy into it, and because of basically how this society limits the value of the arts, propagation of the arts, how it ends up becoming a luxury for upper class children, people higher up in the labor aristocracy, and sometimes even the petty bourgeois and the bourgeois. It ends up being, in many ways, a privilege to be able to acclimate yourself to the fine arts. The masses get their own kind of music. They have to be told a certain thing. The things have to be, they have to be acclimated to a certain message, and that's what ends up happening. But it would be great if musicians like this that take the time to write beautiful interchanges between their songs and to put all the music together, to think about how one album will transition to the next and to the next and to the next. It'd be great if musicians like that were promoted more. And I argue it's only going to happen after a revolution. But we'll see. We'll see. We'll see what the music industry does. However, um, after hearing what they did with rap music and how they made sure to eliminate political messages and eliminate socially conscious messages and to promote criminality, and to highlight and emphasize criminality in conjunction with the prison industrial complex, I wouldn't be holding my breath. I believe that there really needs to be a changing of the guard in how music is propagated and how it's promoted. And I argue for a radical change to the situation. But I digress. So anyways, going into the intermission, we're going to have Eidola's The Great Deception of Marquis Marchosias, from the album Degeneratera. And stay tuned for that, and we'll be right back. Hello, welcome back. Song you heard just now was from Eidola, um, from the album Degeneratera, called The Great Deception of Marquis Marchosias. A lot of beautiful movement in the song. The transitions going from one bit to another. Um, it's great and beautiful music, and the Architect just came out, and I'm hoping that more people appreciate and get acclimated to Eidola and what they do, because they're a very, very good post rock band. Now, getting into the judgment for Ahmed Arbery, um, I believe, quite frankly, that this was kind of an half and half thing. It was largely influenced maybe by the masses, and also influenced by um, how coverage was portraying what was going on in the Rittenhouse case. Very polarized. The right wing wanted to assert he was innocent, and left leaning news wanted to say he was guilty. Although you'll find some liberals with some terrible takes, absolutely disgusting takes, saying I actually saw an incredibly disgusting lesser evilism argument that if people didn't accept the Rittenhouse judgment, then eventually a Republican was going to come back into power, and we can't have that, so we have to accept judgments like this. And that was nonsense. The kind of nonsense that you hear from old white liberals is terrible. I mean, you go around and you look at it, various newspapers, and you'll find a terrible take from Matt Taibbi every now and then. One where he had made the very unscientific claim that China had spread the virus. And just recently he had one where he claimed that Howard Zinn was lying about what Christopher Columbus said in order to defend the legacy of colonialism in the United States. Absolutely liberalism. That's the best you're ever going to get out of U.S. liberals. They're really just fascists with the left face. And that kind of is exemplified in what Matt Taibbi tried to say with the straight face in one of his latest articles, saying Thanksgiving is awesome. They're celebrating Thanksgiving in the United States. And for some reason, he had to defend the holiday by claiming that Howard Zinn was lying about what Christopher Columbus said about the indigenous people that he met there. And of course, he had said something like the indigenous people weren't sinless. Like, not really an excuse. It doesn't matter what they were doing before you came there. You stole the land. You stole the land and you committed genocide. There's nothing, absolutely no excuse for what happened in the 400, 600 years of colonization in the Americas. No excuse for that. And it doesn't matter what anybody in the country at the time was doing. It was their land. They had jurisdiction. And in many cases, the land wasn't owned by anybody in particular. It wasn't public property. So people had free reign. They could freely move about the land. And they had communal leadership, like hereditary chiefs. Much like the communal leadership that's that was around in many parts of Africa. You'll see communal tribal leaders still being promoted and defended in Africa, for example, South Africa, Namibia, even Zimbabwe, many areas of Southern Africa, West Africa. You'll have those communal leaders whose essential job is to preside over the land and to defend the land for the masses and to redistribute the land for the masses. So that's not something that any European colonizer had any justification for dismantling, any excuse for dismantling. And it is important to keep in mind and emphasize the fact that the indigenous societies where there were land property situations and where there was slavery were the ones that the European settlers called the civilized. That was the behavior they were engaging in, is what they deemed to be civilized. So that's always something that is conveniently left out when people make these right-wing defenses of the subjugation of the indigenous masses and their destruction, their genocide, their brutalization. It's that, there were indigenous slave owners. Yes, but those were the ones that the European settlers found common cause with. So let's not forget that. Always conveniently leaving out details like that. And it's not something that's ever going to be allowed on this channel. Not here. Not on the socially radical guitarist. Nobody's going to get away with that. No guest. None. So count your blessings. It's not going to go down. And this ends up kind of segueing into, you have these judgments. One causes riots, and I think the system could brace itself for at least a little bit of an explosion over the Rittenhouse. I don't think the country would have been able to withstand two bad judgments in a row. And I'm sure there was a lot of consciousness around this, maybe around the jury. There was a lot of pressure for the jury thinking about that situation. Also, a lot of pressure on the judge and how they preside over the case. As it turns out, a judge can have a tremendous impact on the case, as you could see with the Rittenhouse situation. The Ku Klux Klan, Bruce Schroeder, eliminating a gun charge, an illegal possessions charge that clearly applied to the situation. No excuse for it, no justification. The smallest length of an AR-15 is 16 inches. And it has to be less than 16 inches to be considered a short-barreled rifle. That was a long-barreled rifle. There was no excuse for that. Absolutely none. And it was done anyways. So that's something to think about. And I actually saw an interesting interview where a black man with his son, he was doing the defense, and he was really disgusted with the judge's behavior. And he had basically said, if that was me, there's no way I would have gotten the right to claim self-defense. There's no way that that charge would have been dismissed and I would have gotten that right. It would never would have happened. And he's right. Um, so half and half. Um, the country is under close scrutiny right now. You find a lot of articles saying that the democracy is crumbling. The democracy is itself under stress. I looked at a recent CPUSA article where where there's a poll and very few people around the world take U.S. democracy seriously anymore, especially not after the Confederate invasion on January 6th and the ridiculous polarization, the ridiculous lack of an ability to even provision basic social services, uh, and the declining living conditions for the masses. All of that is coming together to show a country that has been stripped naked. Especially while they go around claiming that they're going to be there to defend Ethiopian democracy. That is unbelievable. After the country just elected a Ku Klux Klan sympathizer in President Joe Biden. And yeah, those are in many ways, the social dynamics. U.S. imperialism is under crisis. The hand that it had before under Barack Obama just isn't there. The many people that have been disillusioned with Joe Biden have actually been blacks, Latinos, Asians, many of the racialized nations of America have turned away from the supposed unifier, the supposed restorer of cultural norms, the restorer of civility in the United States. Joe Biden, they've turned away. I believe it might have to do with how sobering the information can be on the internet. How it's easier to learn like dark truths that aren't being propagated or portrayed in media. The fact that each politician is giving patronage to their child. It's really a nepotistic situation with Joe Biden and his son Hunter, and the corruption and the dynamics. Many other countries will find themselves being able to take advantage in order to establish political conditions that are more friendly towards but as those things get stripped away and laid bare, the program and what to do about it is still largely in question. These politics and these dynamics will end up greatly affecting Canada because the entire basis of Canadian foreign policy is fealty to NATO, which is led by the United States. Uh, Fealty to NATO, being able to pluck and grab bits and pieces, a mining company here, an oil extraction company there, various different little perks and rewards for going along with that alliance centered on the power and the legitimacy of the United States. So a crisis in the United States is inevitably going to cause a crisis for capitalism within Canada, especially considering how the pandemic was dealt with. I had noticed something pretty interesting from a guest who might be coming soon. His name is Dimitri Laskarius, and he had pointed out how Cuba is now being able to export domestically made vaccines, and how Canada had deliberately dismantled its own production of vaccines. In many ways, it was a capitulation to U.S. dominance to relinquish the country's own capacity to make vaccines, to even in matters of defense, to always purchase from U.S. owned companies. Colt Canada, for example, owned by the United States, by U.S. companies, to basically have a privatized military, and the primary goal is just resource extraction, and that's what makes this settler colony unique. Not particularly unique. In many ways, it's like South Africa, actually. Only difference is South Africa had a democratic revolution. And Canada had an uprising from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy in 1982. So that was the revolution. It was, in many ways, it was a reformist one. It was a militant push to reform, while in South Africa it was much more violent, much more militant, and it culminated in a bourgeois democratic, national democratic revolution. So, while looking at this situation and these conditions, Canada being an arm of the British Empire, exporting resource extraction throughout the world, various mining companies, all of that's now under threat. The illusion of U.S. dominance, the illusion of U.S. superiority in the framework of their so-called democratic system. It'll inevitably lead to crisis, and our task, like my task as a revolutionary, is to give guidance on what would be next. And that would be your task if you join the party as well. Which incidentally we just had a convention, a provincial convention. So those are all things to think about. The answers aren't there from the capitalists, the liberals, the conservatives, and from really the two wings of U.S. fascism, the Democrats and the Republicans. the only countries that have had a solution to this particular crisis with the virus were all communist states. The only countries that had a decisive solution to homelessness, poverty, lack of education were communist states. And the path to victory in this concept is achieving socialism. That's an important thing to emphasize. And I'll leave the show with this. A lot of what the right wing says, yeah, we know we've had our problems with the with the Native Americans. We know we've had our problems with African Americans. But they talk to their socialists in the United States and they say, what solutions do you have? I don't see anybody highlighting Cuba or China or Laos and Vietnam. And in many ways, I looked at this reactionary Republican saying this, and it kind of emphasizes the main point that there's no way to have a serious revolutionary movement without revolutionary theory. And there's no way to have a movement with teeth without that revolutionary practice being emphasized and promoted. So any movement that doesn't defend the legacy of actually existing socialist states is not serious about moving for socialism in the settler colonies. And with that, I'm going to have the Vaniers, as I promised, the Vaniers doing their single No Promises. And it's a very interesting song. It sounds a lot like, surfer music. So look forward to that after the outro, and we'll see you next week. Socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Socially radical. Guitarist.
zu.